Straight Up Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Straight Up Podcast, the show about international affairs with a focus on East Asia and, of course, Taiwan. I'm your host, Chris Gorin, coming to you from Taipei, Taiwan. Most people are probably aware that Taiwan has an aging population. In fact, Taiwan has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. According to the National Development Council, Taiwan's fertility rate in 2022 was 0.87. That makes it either the lowest or nearly the lowest in the entire world, with similar rates to South Korea, Hong Kong, and Puerto Rico. Thus, one can see how government policies that support working mothers are also tied to Taiwan's fertility rates. Today I have on the show Grace Huang. Grace is a professor at St. Lawrence University in New York. She is currently a Fullbright Scholar conducting research for a book project that will compare the policies for working mothers in 3 countries, the United States, Taiwan, and Spain. Her research includes conducting interviews with 25 working women in each country, and her work in Taiwan is the main focus of our conversation. Grace is also the author of the book Chiang Kai-shek's Politics of Shame, published in 2021. Just a quick note, this episode was recorded before Taiwan's presidential election on January 13th, so we had some discussion about the policies of the presidential candidates who were running in that race. But we also covered a large number of topics related to working mothers in Taiwan, including Taiwan's current policies and those proposed by the presidential candidates, the impact of Taiwanese culture on raising children and working, and many other topics. So now I bring you Grace Huang. I am here with Grace Huang. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will probably have done a pre-recorded intro before the beginning of this episode, which I'll add on later, but I would like to also give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up coming to Taiwan.
Hi, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a professor of government at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York, and I teach comparative politics.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to be in Taiwan because I'm doing a research project on working mothers in comparative perspective, looking at Taiwan, Spain, and the U.S. And I'm here on a U.S. Senior Scholar Fullbright grant
to
do
great.
This research.
I also want to give a shout out to your previous book, which has to do with Chiang Kai-shek and the history there. Do you want to tell our listeners just a little bit about the premise of that book?
So that book is kind of a reconsideration of Chiang Kai-shek's leadership, and I look at his politics of shame as he was confronting Japan and Chinese domestic disunity in the Republican period. And I also, in order to really flesh out his politics of shame, I also compare him with Mao Zedong and Yuan Shikai and also Mahatma Gandhi as well. So it was a really fun project to do. And there is a strand that relates to the current research project, which is I'm interested in cultural stories and how individuals use that to achieve their agendas.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, and we may just have to have another podcast some other time about that, because I'd love to read that book. But for the moment, you're working very hard on this current research about working mothers in Spain, U.S., and Taiwan. So tell us a little bit about what your motivation was in coming up with this project and why you chose these 3 countries.
So I think a key reason for doing this is that I'm a working mother myself. And when I was going through it, I thought I was the only, not that I was the only one, but it was a very difficult process in that I married when I was 34, and it seemed as if 35 is the age where you become not too old to be a mother, but that maybe problems might happen with your child. So I had a child a year later, but I was also starting my position at St. Lawrence University. And so it was really difficult to learn how to teach well, to make research, to transform it into publications. And then really when you have a baby, that's a whole nother full-time job. So learning how to take care of a baby. So it was a really difficult period. And my husband was teaching at another university. So this is also a problem in academia. But using my lens as a comparativist, I also know that this is a problem for developed democracies, right? In the sense that when women have more education, they delay getting married and they delay having children. And it's also a problem for the state because when that happens, you have lower fertility, right? And so this is an interest of the state to make sure there's enough children. Otherwise, it's a security issue, who's going to be in the military and who's going to be paying taxes. So I knew that this was an important issue, not just on a personal level. So I wanted to write a book for my younger self, but also it is an important political issue. And because I'm a comparativist, I strongly believe you really learn a lot about your own culture. So this is the US when you compare it to other cultures.
Sure. So then it seems obvious why, you're an American, you chose US as one of your case studies, but why Taiwan and why Spain?
Oh, so my parents are from Taiwan, but I was born in the United States. So I have familial connections with Taiwan. And because of my book on Chiang Kai-shek, I learned Chinese. And I think if you're going to conduct interviews, you need to know the language to really get into the stories in Taiwan. It's also, I think, when we think about comparative politics in the US, a lot of the work is done of democracies, the United States and Europe. So I really wanted an Asian country. And I can't speak Korean or
Right.
Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the Spanish side, my husband is Spanish. And so we've been married for 18 years now. And about every other year, we spend an extended time in Spain. So I also am familiar with the familial culture in Spain. And also I will need to brush up on my Spanish, but I think that's my next part, to be interviewing Spanish mothers.
Okay, so you do intend to, in each of the three cases, you intend to use the native language to do all of your interviews?
I feel a little bit hesitant about the Spanish one. I can understand. Maybe I can corral my husband to be a part of it, but we'll see.
Okay.
But I think the language is important.
And you said he's a researcher as well?
Yeah, he's a physics professor.
Okay. Right. So that's great. So you, based on the outline of your research that I have seen, you're focused on democratic regimes and the welfare states that they produce. And you sort of make this distinction between liberal versus social democratic systems. So help us out a little bit with the definitions there. What differentiates a liberal from a social democratic welfare
Okay.
state?
Great. So a liberal democratic state, so the US is an example of that, tends to, on a very at the simplest level, emphasizes freedom over equality. So the state will tend to have a more laissez-faire approach. And so policies that come out tend to you don't have a strong government presence, right? So in the US, we don't have universal health care. We don't really support, it's not the government supporting working mothers. I mean, we have 12 weeks of unpaid leave. That's really difficult to manage. But there are always trade-offs in how you think about things. And so in the US, your coffee is cheap. Buying clothes at Walmart, you can get a t-shirt for $5 and that you pay less taxes. So that's the US. In Europe, they tend to have more of a social democratic system. And so the policies that come out there, the emphasis is on a balance of freedom and equality, right? So communism is all about equality, but a social democracy tries to balance the two. So in this system, there is more of a stronger sense of the government in place to make sure that you don't have too much inequality. And so this system will have higher taxes, upwards of 50%. Goods are more expensive, so a t-shirt would be $35. And then there's just more support for women. The daycare system is robust. If you need to take time off, you get replacement wages. And so there's more taxes, but then there's also more government services to support the people.
So, not just counting the three states that you've included, but just like to illustrate, if we're talking about a spectrum of liberal to social democratic, what are, in your mind, what are the two extreme end countries of these two systems? Like, what's the most social democratic when you're thinking of what that means, and what's like the most liberal state?
Well, for sure, the most social democratic and the most successful and considered the gold standard would be the Scandinavian countries. And so you see, when we talk about equality, there's also a lot of gender equality. So you will also see more of the males helping with the care, women not stopping their work, and really strong policies for helping the care. That's a good question. I mean, the US is definitely on the other end. Maybe you could pick countries that have extreme inequality, like even more extreme inequality, but then they might not be democracies. So let's just put,
Right.
do you have a country in mind?
Well, no, I was just curious myself because I think that, yeah, in my mind, I would have said the same, sort of the US tends to be more liberal. That would be my standard. And then the Scandinavians, it's almost a stereotype kind of, but they are seen
Yes.
as the kind of most socially democratic states. And for social democrats in the US, they are a kind of ideal that they're trying to reach, has sort of been my experience in conversations about that. But I was kind of curious, just as someone who studied it a lot more than I have, if you have found that there's another sort of liberal state that could be another example other than the US.
I would maybe look at South Africa,
Okay.
but I don't have much more to say.
Okay. Yeah, no.
in that
And that's
sense.
also just to,
I would say you brought up the social democrats in the United States, that they still are, yes, you're right, they are an ideal, because they're still falling within the liberal tradition. So they still also have notions of less government. And so the policies that have
you
been...
mean compared to Scandinavian countries?
Yes.
Okay.
So if they're pushing for policies, sometimes it's through the back door. So a lot of help is coming through the tax code, child credit, things of this nature. And so it's not seen.
And I mean, this may be splitting hairs, but do you think that that comes from the sense of that is the right way to do it, or that is just the more politically possible option in terms of getting a policy passed through Congress? Because I think, they may want to have it just straight state support providing services, but they just might feel that it's more politically palatable to get a bill that, gives a tax break for a certain activity instead.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think in the 70s and 80s, and that was what they were able to compromise and get through.
Okay, great. So now that we've defined that, I guess we've already discussed where you place the U.S. on this spectrum, but what about Spain and Taiwan? Where do they sit on this spectrum?
So Spain is a social democracy, but not as strong as the Scandinavian countries. Spain is similar to Taiwan in, I think both have family as something strong in their culture. So on the spectrum, Spain is not as social democratic as the Scandinavian countries, but relatively social democratic. Taiwan is not on the other side, but it's somewhere in between. So it has liberal democratic tendencies and social democratic tendencies, but it's of a different flavor.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that. What are the sort of specifically these sort of like hybrid institutions in Taiwan that sort of place it in the center and a little bit harder to put on one end or the other?
So social democracies, you are getting these policies because you have strong parties that push for these policies. But Taiwan is maybe what we would consider a late developer, right? So if we had Germany and Russia as late developers, and then Japan a late developer, right? Taiwan, just, even a generation ago, they were working really hard, right, in manufacturing and also in agriculture, right? And so it's only now, this generation, where it's more of a developed democracy and interested in jobs are more service oriented, and now they're thinking about quality of life. So that's one aspect that is different. It's more top down. So whatever policies you're seeing that look liberal or look social democratic, some of it's more state led because of this history. So for instance, why is it all blurred? When I was looking at their Labor Standard Act from 1984, I thought, wow, this is so progressive. They give 8 weeks of paid maternal leave for mothers. And I thought, wow, but the U.S. doesn't even give this. Mm-hmm. Why are they thinking this way? And in fact, if you look deeper, it's coming from top down. And ironically, it's coming from U.S. pressure, because the U.S. was wanting Taiwan to increase its standard of living so that jobs weren't being taken away from the U.S. And so they were forcing the government to adopt international labor laws. And so that's why you have the 8 weeks of paid maternity leave, even things on miscarriage and breastfeeding in 1984. So, right, and when they dealt with COVID, it's also a very strong government presence, right? So there's social democratic tendencies that are top down. But it's also liberal, right, in the sense that the work environment is nothing like in Europe. People work really hard here, maybe even more than in the United States. And some of the solutions that they are coming up with are more private sorts of solutions. And so that is liberal in orientation and also coming from top down. But it's a democracy, so there's also bottom up. And so you have women's groups in the 1990s that are also they particularly pushed a social democrat, the Scandinavian model for Taiwan. So they wrote 2 books in the 1990s. One is called The Women's Condition in Taiwan in 1995 and Women's State and Care Work in 1997. And this is kind of put the blueprint for what different groups want. It's a more social democratic model, right? So this is bottom up.
And do you feel like that the society has achieved those goals that they set out to achieve in terms of policies for working mothers as they were laid out in these books in the 90s?
No.
Okay. So then tell us a little bit about what they have done and maybe a little bit about where the parties are now. What are the presidential candidates saying about what they want to do in these areas? Tell us a little bit about how that has developed.
So a lot has happened in the last 25 years. I would say in the 1990s and 2000s, the idea was to go for gender equity. But then in the last 10 years or so, the government got really worried about the low fertility rate. So the number that they'll give ranges. So for Taiwan, it's 0.87 to 1.2. That's the fertility rate. And the replacement rate is 2.1.
Right.
So if we use...
well below replacement rate.
Yes. If we use 0.98 as a comparison, South Korea is at 0.79 and Japan is at 1.3. So this was a huge concern. And so that really accelerated different kinds of more subsidies. Okay. So let's go back to what are the sorts of things they've done. It's not there yet. And I think the liberal policies are in there and the social democratic policies, like both are being pushed and both are inadequate. Mm. So maybe we could start with what policies there are.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So we can look at their 5 different policies from conception to childcare. So the first policy is IVF. So now they will support NT 100,000 for the first time. And then from the second to the 6th time, it's 60,000.
Yeah, I've heard of this, but I do think that there is one important caveat about IVF in Taiwan, if I'm not mistaken, which is that single women cannot.
Right.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about that and because I don't know all the technical details about this law, but when I first heard about this, it kind of blew my mind because that seems like a very strong government intrusion into a personal decision. And so I'm a little bit curious about, do you know the legal boundaries there about, what is legally required to get IVF in Taiwan?
Yes, so you have to be married,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the spouses has to be a Taiwan citizen.
And do you know if this applies to same-sex marriages?
It does not apply to same-sex marriages.
Okay.
And so that it's really ironic, right? Because the low fertility is you have a lot of people who are not choosing to have children.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden you have single women, definitely lesbian couples and gay couples who want to have a surrogacy. They clearly want children,
Right.
and they will go. I interviewed one lesbian mom. She had to go to the U.S. and to Thailand and pay out of pocket for these procedures. So this part, there may be some kind of a cultural constraint
Right.
here about who is worthy, I'm putting it in quotes,
Right.
to have a baby.
Right. So, so that when we said IVF, so they get a subsidy for that.
Okay.
So what else is there available?
They also have something called a birth bonus, which
Okay.
to me is like some kind of a red envelope as a reward for the mother having a child. So each of the local governments provide a different amount, and they range from 10,000 to 20,000, and it keeps increasing. So recently, this year, the Taipei government increased it to 40,000 NT just for having a baby. Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry, just that one in particular, because I remember when, they increased this amount. And maybe we can save all this for after you say all the policies, but I'm just wondering if you think that amount is enough to change anyone's mind about any.
I think this is the dumbest of them all, even though
Okay.
it sounds exciting.
Right. Yeah.
And
because
we'll see the presidential candidates even upping this amount, but I don't think this is a good idea.
Yeah, to me, it's not. I mean, any amount helps up someone who's struggling, right? But at the same time, if the idea is to get a result, a utilitarian result to have more children in the society, I feel like this is it's such a small amount that there's absolutely no way that this would influence anyone's decision to have a child or not. Of course, it's helpful if they get it, but it just doesn't even make contact with the amount that would actually influence someone's decision whether or not to have a baby financially. So
I'm there with you, but I think if you're a presidential candidate, it is attractive to say something like this to get
you're doing
votes.
something.
Yes.
Right.
And for the ruling government, just that you have these subsidies.
Sure.
Okay. Then there is the maternity leave and the paternal leave right after the baby is born, right? So the mother gets 7 days of, not just the birth. So she can have 7 days of pregnancy checkup. This was increased from before, and then the 2 months full salary. The paternal leave is 7 days. So that can be split between the birth of the baby and then also pregnancy checkup, and that's at full pay. So the issue with this is the difference between maternal leave and paternal leave is that right from the beginning, it's reinforcing gender stereotypes, right? So the woman becomes the sole caretaker in those very crucial first weeks. So she's gaining competency in care, but it's also really difficult. It's on her. And then it's reinforced she knows what she's doing. And then the husband, it's reinforced that he needs to go back to work. The other issue about the 2 months full salary is that there are many service industries that are predominantly women where they don't get the full pay. So if you think about the hairdresser or the massage therapist, their income is based on the number of clients that they have. And if they're not working, they don't have clients.
Right. They're not wage workers, essentially.
Right.
Yeah. So they don't
get it.
These laws wouldn't apply. Right.
I think the policy that is really promising is the paid parental leave.
Mm-hmm.
So it used to be that it was no pay. So that wasn't good. And then it was 60%, and now it's 80% for 6 months for the mother and or the father. So the mother could do it 6 months and the father could do it for 6 months. It used to be that you had to take 6 months all at once, but now you can do it 1 month at a time.
Mm.
And some people are trying to push it for even more flexibility because they're saying, well, if the child is only sick for 1 week, you still have to take the whole month off.
Mm-hmm.
So they want it in a smaller...
Oh, so it's like a minimum of 1 month.
Yes.
Like the smallest amount of time you could take off is 1 month in this
yes,
policy.
for a total of 6.
Okay. Got it.
Okay. And then I think
And,
that...
sorry,
oh, go
that's
ahead.
that's a policy that is already in place?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So then the last policy, and I think the most important policy, right, especially for working mothers who want to go back to work, is childcare.
Mm-hmm.
And here we see a proliferation of support. So there are public daycares, and those are relatively affordable. And you get a subsidy, $5,500 per month, if your child is enrolled in one of those. And the price is reasonable for those. But it's very difficult to get in. There's a lottery, and you often don't get in. So then you're still stuck with, what are you supposed to do with your child?
Can I ask, these daycare centers, are they state-run or are they privatized and subsidized?
So the public one is state
Okay.
run, but that's a small portion.
Mm.
There are other kinds of daycares. So what you're describing, then there are these public, quasi-public daycares. So they're on public property, but it's privately done. It's outsourced to a private. And so these, you get a subsidy of $8,500. Okay. Or if you can't get into one of those, you could also, or you don't want to put your child in there, you could have a nanny. They call it a 保姆. So the nanny could come to your house, or the nanny might be taking care of other children in her own house. And that's also $8,500.
And what about access? I'm wondering about these subsidies. Is it the sort of application process or how one actually attains the subsidy itself, or is it just built into, like, when you go to pay, they just deduct that amount? I mean, is there any issue with people being able to access these subsidies, or is it?
I have heard of no problems accessing it. Okay. There just seems the money or let's just say you are the one taking care of the child. You get $5,000. It just goes right into your bank.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yes.
Okay, so those are the current policies. Tell us a little bit about, we're just weeks away from the election here, the date of this recording. Tell us about what some of the presidential candidates and their parties are proposing for working mothers.
Okay, so one pathway is the monetary support, right? Because they want to increase the number of babies. And I feel that this is not necessarily helping working mothers. It is trying to incentivize having more children. So Lai Ching-te of the Democratic Progressive Party has this wide sweeping policy of supporting children from 0 to 22, right? That even women's groups, they're thinking 0 to 12, but it's 0 to 22. And he's increasing...
Why 22? That seems like such a random...
College. You want to support university level.
Okay, right.
Hou You-yi of the Kuomintang now, it's not just conception, but it's about freezing eggs. So wants to give 20,000 to a female who wants to freeze the eggs, and then to help with the storing of eggs, which is just 2,000 per year up to 5 years. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much help this would be, right?
Yeah,
and
2,000 NT, that's like 60 US dollars. Yeah.
And then it doesn't necessarily sound like this is for single women, right? Given the IVF. So,
right.
I mean, I think the population who would really like this would be people who haven't found their mate yet. Mm-hmm. And And then he has this other policy. Yes, the housing is really expensive here. That families with 3 or more children, he wants to give 1 million NT housing subsidy. So that's around $31,000. But I mean, if people are having trouble having one, there's not that many families that are 3 children or more.
Right. So this would only
So
apply to families of what,
3
3 or more
children.
children.
Yes.
Yeah, and again, this is so bizarre because if again, it kind of goes back to the original the baby bonus kind of thing, which is that I mean, that's not an insignificant amount of money. That is actually real money. On the other hand, if you have to have 3 children to get access to it, it isn't going to influence someone having their first child. So I just kind of feel like if the goal of the policy is to improve the fertility, improve the birth rate, then it's not going to have that effect. It's only going to affect people who already have families. And if you're already at 2, you're basically at the replacement rate anyway. So it just seems a little bit, they're just aiming for the wrong target, I feel. But I do think it does bring up an important issue, which is that I do think that there are some issues in Taiwanese society, outside of what the government is doing to support working mothers that really affect people's decision whether or not to do that. And one of them is the cost of housing. And I've talked about this, with a few other guests before, so I don't want to beat this drum too hard. But, the difference between the median wage and the median price of a house in Taiwan is just vastly larger than in most developed societies, especially, well, I should say that it particularly applies to Taipei City. But I do feel like this is an issue that they will need to tackle just as much as direct state support for working mothers if they actually want to influence people's choices about, creating families.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. Got off my soapbox here. Okay, so, let's bring it back to the comparative perspective a little bit here. So, given all of the policies that you just stated about Taiwan, how do those compare, in general to the policies that are available to Spain, to working mothers in Spain and the United States? Given the caveat that I know in the US, it's a little bit complicated because there's a lot of state level policies that are quite different across the different states. But just generally speaking, what have you kind of found in this area in terms of how they compare?
Well, certainly with the United States, these are really generous policies.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of social democracies, I would rather, at least these policies, I would not compare it to Spain. I would compare it more to Germany, which has, we call it not necessarily a social democratic system. Another way of calling it is a Christian democratic system, where instead of having the state do it, they do cash transfers. So this method of giving cash to the family and then trusting that they will use the money the best way they can, that's more of the German way of doing things.
In other words, it's like instead of getting a subsidy for a particular program, you would just get like a monthly cash payment to use however you see fit as a parent.
Yes. Oh, I should mention, Kowenza has this idea, 50,000 NT for pregnant women at 3 months, and then 100,000 for when they give birth. So it's just really ratcheting up the subsidies. But there is also the other path of bolstering the daycare, right? So this is the other path, which is you probably need to, the public daycares end at 4. People work till 6. So they want to extend daycare hours. They want to raise teachers' salary, right? So here's the other thing. How can you be paying on average just 35,000 NT? That's what, 13 or 14,000 US per year. And if you can't get yourself into a daycare, many are paying private daycare, it's 20,000. So the salary is not enough, right? So the public direction, it's good, but you should at least double the salary.
Yeah, and again, I've recently had a whole episode about wages in Taiwan, and I was going to kind of make that point earlier too about the houses, which is that it's all well and good to target money at these specific areas like working mothers, but there's also this other fact, and it kind of reminded me when you said this thing about the cash payment in Germany, which is that it would just be nice if people wouldn't need the subsidies because they could just afford it because the wages were enough to live on. But another major problem in Taiwan is just that the average wages are so low. And now you're saying like even, a lot of these jobs where women are working in the service industry are particularly low. So yeah, I do think that is a major issue. And then I did want to just clarify. So you said the average teacher wage is 35,000 NT
In the daycare.
in a daycare.
And they want to raise it, but when they're raising it, it's like or maybe it's 33,000, and then they want to raise it 2,000. This is so little.
Yeah, again,
Okay.
60 more US dollars per month, which is really not going to impact their life at all. But you said someone gets 20,000 per month?
Oh, no. So the public daycares
Yeah.
are so difficult to get in that a lot of people have to exercise the private option.
Mm-hmm.
And those private daycares, it's 20,000 NT
Oh, I
to just,
see.
right? So if you're making a salary of 35,000, how can you
Oh,
spend
right.
20,000
Right.
on the daycare, even with the help of 5,000, right? It's still a lot of money.
So we've discussed a bit about the government policies about working women in Taiwan, but let's talk a little bit about the other issue, which is really influential, which is culture. And, maybe we should just preface this a little bit by saying, that I know that talking about culture and social science is always a little bit of a sensitive topic because we don't want to essentialize a society or reduce every problem and solution in their culture and their society to their culture, because I think there's it's a dangerous route to essentialize that much. That being said, I think we cannot deny the influence of different cultural values, systems, and family structures, and how that influences raising a child and a decision to have children. So Taiwan, definitely, I'm American myself, so I can definitely see some pretty strong differences between how families deal with children. So let's go over a few of those. What do you find are like the specific cultures in Taiwan that really influence either a decision to have children or just how children are raised?
So in terms of the work culture, there is, I think this may be a holdover from the previous generation where they were working all the time, right? And the goal was to just provide for their children. So it's a different stage of development. But even now, so you may be working from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and then you might add a commute an hour each way. And so you basically don't really have time to see your children. And in talking with a lot of these working mothers, even that break, they are working through that break. And then you have, in the service industry, you have creative accounting, right? So, in what you might be working from, let's say, 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. So the idea is you have a 2-hour break and then 1 hour of overtime. But in that 2-hour break, you may be also working. And then you might want to go home and see your child. So then you don't get that overtime pay. So that's just been a very difficult work culture. And the way that I look at culture is I think of it as a malleable structure. So the culture is not essentialized. I think that's not a good way of looking at it, but it changes based on historical circumstances. And as a malleable culture, what I'm also looking at, I think about women's stories is how do they adapt the culture or resist it or change it in their own lives, right? And so how do women deal with this kind of environment? So I'm looking at that. And so I see that women, they do want to have a connection with their children, which maybe they felt was lacking from the previous generation. So they do switch jobs, or they go part-time, or they quit. Or if the job is really important, they make the decision to just farm out that care full time. So it's either the parents or the in-laws or full-time nanny or even a 24-hour nanny. So they make these sorts of decisions. The companies are also adjusting. So some of these companies might allow, just recently, mothers to work 2 days from home. So that saves on the commute time. Or companies might be flexible to allow children to come to work if they're sick. So these are things I think that help change the culture.
I did want to ask a little bit when we were talking about the paid parental leave and other similar policies in Taiwan. When you mentioned that there's up to 6 months, and as an American, that actually sounds quite generous. But I'm wondering how many people are actually using that.
So we can look at it in stages. So when it was passed with no pay, nobody was really taking it. And then at 60%, you really didn't have men taking it. But now you do see, at 80%, you do see more. But your question is, yes, the culture is one where you don't feel like you could take it, right? Yeah. So then it also, again, depends on the occupation, right? So if you're in the bank industry, you might be able to switch off with somebody, or maybe a project is done, so you can leave for a bit of time. Yeah, they're very thoughtful, cognizant of what the employee needs.
Okay. So it sounds like actually people are taking advantage of it. So
More
that's good to
and
hear.
more, yes. Even the men.
Right.
Yeah.
But
it's very recent.
Right. And I would still question, I would like to hear actually some, I look forward to reading your research to see how that is being handled in the workplace, because I'm actually a little bit surprised to hear that a lot of people are doing it. My sense is that...
No, not a lot of people.
Oh, okay.
Compared to before, there are more and more, but overall numbers, it's still not that much.
Right. More is a relative term.
Yes. From zero.
Right.
We have to, that's what I'm comparing
well, from 0 to 1,
to.
that's 100%
yes,
increase.
Right.
Okay. So beyond the working culture, what other...
Family culture is also important to look at. And there's, in Taiwan, this intergenerational care where you see many parents or in-laws, they will take care of the child full time. And then what's also interesting is there's kind of a familial contract where the money seems to stay within the family. So rather than pay a daycare, you pay your mom, or dad, like a certain amount of money because they are the daycare providers.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting.
That is very interesting, and it brings up, I know you've written a blog post kind of about this, and is interesting to me as well, which is the whole sort of culture of cash giving as a gift or for other services, because I do think that, in the US, it would be very unusual to pay your parents for a favor, and just giving gifts in general, a Chinese New Year, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable giving and getting hongbao, because it just, and again, it is probably just my sort of like, cultural bias, but giving gifts of cash to me is like, it's just, there's something about it that doesn't sit super well with me. Like, I don't have any moral judgment about it, but I just personally, I don't like giving cash as a gift. But, in Taiwan, it's not only accepted, but it's, often expected in many situations. So let's talk a little bit about that, the culture of cash giving and how that also works within families.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's something that seems transactional about it. And then we don't want our money our love to be bought, especially within the family. And all of our traditions, holiday traditions, they involve gifts. Right?
Yeah. And there's something about that, the putting a number on it that you can sort of trace historically, because if you give less than you used to, it's like they notice that, right? So, but in this case, in terms of raising children, yes, you may pay your parents to do some babysitting, but how else does money get involved in sort of gifting between family members and raising children?
it seems to be, right, so there's no connotations that we have
Right.
in the US. So it seems to be a very efficient way of helping each other out, right? So I know of one cleaner who gets money from her daughter, but she saves it so that later on she can give the money back. Right. So it's a way of helping each other. Another family, on one side, she gives 600 over the New Year, 600 to the in-laws, and the in-laws give 600 back. So it's just a symbolic thing. And then on the other side, 2,000 back and forth. So they try to even it out if they can. But if you have a big flood, so one family had a big flood. So then the daughter thought, I can give you 40,000 or 50,000. And so it's just a way to help out.
Right. Yeah. And in the, there is a kind of logic to it that I think makes sense, right? It's like the bottom line is like cash is a more useful gift than a lot of other gifts, right? But it's just more of like, I guess maybe it's a sentimental thing, or maybe it's just our cultural bias. But for me, I still struggle with that culture a little bit myself. I mean, have you experienced any of this with your living in Taiwan and your family in Taiwan?
Yes. So for my own wedding, I found it really difficult to find items for a gift registry. And I spent 2 hours at Macy's trying to scan items. And I think I only got 4 items. It was just so difficult. So at that time, both the Spanish side and and my side, they just gave us cash gifts. And so that, so in some ways it was as if we were following the Taiwan culture.
Okay.
There. And it makes me think some of the gifts, like if you think about birthday gifts in the US, it's a lot of things that may not be useful and then gets thrown away.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So in Spain, they give gifts, but it's very thoughtful. So it could be something small, but it's well thought of and well made. So it's also interesting to see different styles.
Yeah, how is the cash culture in Spain? Would you say it leans more towards what we would expect in America, where it's not usually done, or is it a little bit more accepted?
I'm curious too, Chris.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not, I didn't ask about those things. So that'll be something when my research takes me to Spain to find more about.
So what about the husband's role in raising children in Taiwan? How is that different from maybe Spain or the US?
So I was exposed to the terms, I don't know if you have heard of, maybe you have, from the very beginning, that husbands fall into 2 categories. One is called the 神队友. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't heard.
It's translated maybe as the spirit partner, 神. That's a bad translation. But the other, so that's the good husband.
Okay.
The other one you will understand. It's the 猪队友. So it's the pig husband. So that's clearly the bad husband.
Right. Okay. So we've got the spiritual partner and the pig partner. Okay.
Yes. And then, so what you see here, so the worry is, policies, maybe family backgrounds, it might reinforce more of the pig husband, just that all of the duties fall on the wife. But because you have, this is a new generation, it's more of a nuclear family, right? You don't have as many kids. The husband is going to need to take a larger role. And so what I hear from wives who have these sorts of husbands is they train the husband. So sometimes it's through fights, right? To just say, to make the husband understand, this is a lot of work for me. You need to take more responsibility. Or through encouragement. So anytime they do something, to encourage them to do more. So in these ways, to encourage husbands to take on more cleaning duties as well as taking care of the child.
What would you notice as like the biggest differences between, because I kind of feel like some of what you're saying could apply, maybe not the most extreme sort of like the pig husband kind of thing where the woman does everything, but I do think that even in Western societies, there's a lot of struggles in marriages and couples about, how much work the husband should be doing and so forth. But have you noticed anything that is particular to Taiwan that has stuck out to you in this area?
No,
Okay.
but I like how you're going with this question. So I would need to think about that more. There
Okay.
may be, I think some are culturally different, like the gift giving,
Mm-hmm.
but others seem to have a more universal flavor.
Right.
And this seems to be something more universal that a culture doesn't necessarily tell us something
Right.
different.
Another big difference between Taiwan and the U.S. is, hired help. I think that there's quite a different culture about hiring help and the sort of social pressures or lack thereof that comes with that. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so I found that at all levels, even if you're a single mom with not that high paying of a job, you're able to hire help.
In Taiwan, you mean?
In Taiwan,
Right.
to take care of your child, to take care of your house. I think that is similar in Spain as well. And I think what helps that is you have caretakers in Taiwan from Southeast Asia coming. And in Spain, you have them coming from Latin America. And the US, I feel it's more difficult for us to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe part of it is our liberal tradition. We want to depend on ourselves.
Right. Although I think part of it is also the cost, right? I feel like in the
Yes.
U.S., getting a full-time caretaker would probably be extremely expensive. And I do think there's might even be some cultural stigma around it, as you say, that I don't know, it's something that only very rich people would do to hire like a care worker, or maybe there's just, you feel like that means I can't do it myself, or you're not really fully taking care of your own child, this kind of thing.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas but you're saying in Taiwan that doesn't really seem.
Yes. Yeah. And even that it is accessible to all different levels.
Mm-hmm.
And the help isn't just, but they have this other culture of they really care about education. So even at the poorest level, they will have hire tutors and things for their kids, which is also another form of care because
Right.
you can go to work as your child is being tutored.
Yeah, obviously a lot of foreigners living in Taiwan are English teachers, and most of them teach at what are called bushiban, which is
Yes.
like the school after school. And it seems like almost every child will go to bushiban.
Yes.
And at first I found this to be like, wow, this is such an extreme culture. But then I realized, yeah, it's kind of it's a form of childcare.
Yes.
It allows the parents to work later, and it's like, well, they might as well go learn English after,
Yes. Yes.
while they're waiting for me to come
So
home.
it's, two birds because
Right.
they emphasize education and they need care help.
Right, right. Yeah, and we don't have a similar culture in America, I would say. It's
No.
if you go to after school tutoring, it sounds like either you're having some really serious learning issues, or your parents are just super strict.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it may be sports. That's the thing
Right.
that takes over.
Yeah, sure. And then the other thing is, you say that, yeah, a lot of the home care workers in Taiwan are actually migrant workers coming from mostly Southeast Asian countries.
So these workers, so let me be clear, they are not actually authorized to take care of children. The way the policies work is they're supposed to take care of the elderly,
Right.
right? But there's a lot of stuff going under the table, and if you happen to have elderly and then there are also
Right.
children, they can take care of the children, or there's other business like the elderly person is in a home, in an old age home, and then they use that person to take care of the children. So it's a lot of things going on.
Yeah, well, because I was thinking it's more common for, 3 generations to live together in Taiwan than in the States. And so, yeah, if you hire someone to take care of your elderly grandmother, but also living in the same house with the children, and then you basically just also ask them to take
Yes.
care of the children while they're there. So,
Yes.
but one cultural thing that is
Okay.
quite different, I think, is this practice of sitting confinement.
Oh, yes.
So tell us a little bit about that. What is sitting confinement?
I was really jealous when I heard about this tradition. Well, first, so in Chinese, it's called 坐月子. And traditionally, it had been done you spend a month at home, and there are a bunch of rituals that go with it that you can do or not do, including you're not supposed to wash your hair for the month. You're not supposed to go outside, but it's a time where you can recuperate, and people cook you really nutritious meals.
Right. And this is for the mother after she gives birth.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Now there's a new, like a whole industry called sitting confinement centers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where you can go and you can pay between 6,000 NT per day upwards to 15,000 NT per day to just be taken care of
Right.
24 hours.
Right.
So they'll take care of the baby, and you can look at your baby through a window or through a monitor, and you're being nourished. Some have yoga centers, and you can feel safe about the child because there are doctors and nurses, and they'll also teach you how to bathe the child and all of this.
Okay. But when you say like you look at them through a window, or are you not supposed to be too close to the child during this time?
No, just if you want to visit the child, you go to this floor and you see them with all the other babies.
Okay.
But certainly they can wheel the baby to your room, and then you have time with your baby for sure.
So the confinement is not like to confine yourself away from the
No.
baby.
It's 坐月子.
Right.
I don't know why they call it sitting confinement. It is a little bit, some people think it's like a prison if you can't go out.
Yeah.
But it's the sitting the month. Maybe that's another way of
Yeah. So it's like a month period of rest where you just don't, you don't do anything, and other people help you take care of the child so that you can, I guess, so that your body can recover is the idea. And it's interesting, but that this still persists, and now they have these hotels essentially that are specialized for this. So I assume you did not do this when your child was born.
Didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't.
But you feel like you would have done it if you had had the chance?
I think so, but maybe I would adapt it. I think I could do it for a week to 10 days. And I think if you do it too long, in the end, you have to go home with that baby and take care. You are only delaying the inevitable of that difficulty. Mm-hmm. So you may not want to delay it that long. And as I'm interviewing more women, this is a privilege for people who have money. If you don't, you just have a regular, it's maybe like how I did it. You still have to have a regular day. So not everybody has, everybody will have a different adaptation. So if you have to do it at home, you will get special meals.
This brings up an interesting question because, for example, through all the public policies that we spoke about, there doesn't seem to be a carve out for this particular practice. So like this practice has not been institutionalized, for example, in the kind of paid leave policies, where it would be expected that every woman would necessarily do 坐月子 and not go to work. Seems like a strong cultural practice, but not so strong that it's been institutionalized in that way.
But I would say, so I think it's the care part, right? That is important to support, not these other things that are temporary. But I would imagine, so if I were a mother and I got 40,000 NT, I would just take that money and spend it at the sitting confinement center. So
I see.
It's not necessarily helping with my long-term care, but I think I would, so that money may end up there, right? Because that's like the first thing that you would spend money on.
Okay, well, we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I do just want to ask a kind of final reflection on, you're still working on your research in Taiwan. You haven't even gotten to the part in Spain yet, but just based on what you've noticed so far between the U.S. and Taiwan, what do you think that raising a child would be more challenging in Taiwan than in the U.S. or vice versa? Or I don't know, what are your sort of initial conclusions about the comparison between these two places?
Yes, with the sitting confinement and with all of these policies, I thought, wow, I wish I had those things. It was difficult for me. But now, as I'm coming towards the end of my research, I still think it's easier in the U.S., mostly because of the work environment. I think those long hours make it really difficult, and it's a little more inflexible as well.
Okay, well, this has been a very interesting conversation. I think that all of us will look forward to reading your research when it's finally published. And I'm interested to see about Spain as well. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for taking the time. And is there anything else that we can push for you here that people should go if they want to check out your research, your previous or current?
Oh, I suppose they can take a look at my blog. So I've been blogging posts as I'm doing this research, and that's been a lot of fun to kind of crystallize my ideas. The blog is called Field Notes of a Working Mother in Taiwan.
Okay. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. Okay, Grace Huang, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Till next time.
It's a straight up podcast.